I saw my cheating wife at a gala dinner with her ex-husband, so I went up to them and said, "From now on you are single and on the street. I want a divorce now. And get ready to say goodbye to our children, because I will take custody of them and I will stop you from seeing them." She was desperate. And at that moment, I discovered that the most searing pain that a human being can feel is not that of loss, nor that of death, nor that of rejection, it is the pain of contempt coming from the one you loved most in the world, from whom you would never suspect. Her gaze trembled, the glass slowly slipped between her fingers, and even so, I didn't feel sorry. Just anger. Accumulated anger, suffocated by years of silence, of blind trust, of total surrender to a woman who, inside, had no longer existed for me for a long time. The silence in that room weighed more than the crystal lights hanging from the ceiling. Everyone looked. And no one dared to interfere. Because, at that moment, everyone knew, an irreversible truth had been released. For years, I was the exemplary husband. I worked like a convict to build the home of my dreams, with a garden, happy children and a beloved woman by my side. I was a partner, counselor, lover and father. I didn't mind putting off my personal dreams for the sake of our family. I canceled trips, postponed invitations, ignored opportunities, everything to be present. To see her smile. To hear her say she loved me. But today, looking at her sitting at that table with the same man who once made her cry, the same creature she said she hated, I asked myself, did she ever really love me? It took months of being suspicious of the smallest details. A different scent when I came home from work. Messages deleted more frequently than before. A distant look during dinners. The sudden refusal to lay with me. But never, not even in my nightmares, did I imagine that she would have the courage to reopen the door to the man who destroyed her past. The same one who promised he would never have space in his life again. And more than that, she did it without giving me the right to understand, to ask questions, to suffer with dignity. He betrayed not only my love, but my time, my story, my name. She cheated on the father of her children. The worst part was not finding them together. The worst part was the way she looked at me when she saw me standing there, staring at that charade. A look of fright, yes, but not one of regret. It was the look of someone who didn't expect to be caught, but who, deep down, knew that this moment would come one day. And when I told her, in a firm voice, that she was on the street, that I would stay with our children and that she would never see them again, she finally cried. But not out of love. He cried out of fear. Because of the fear of losing the comfort, the status, the image that he built for me. She cried because of the panic of losing what she said she loved, but never knew how to value. I remember every face at that party. All those elegant guests, mesmerized by the scene. Some pretending not to look. Others frozen in silence. But what struck me most was his look. From the man sitting next to her. The ex. The reason for the fall. The man who, with a cynical smile, simply watched me as if I were a momentary obstacle. He didn't even try to hide his pride. The arrogance of those who think they won a dirty war. But little did he know that this was not the end. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. After that night, she tried to look for me. Made excuses. She said she was confused, that it wasn't what it seemed. That I needed time. That he still loved me. That her children needed her. But I was no longer the man I used to be. The one who believed her words. He who forgave the unforgivable in the name of a family. The one who carried everything on his shoulders to keep a lie going. I was different. I was the very consequence of her mistakes. And she didn't know how to deal with it. The divorce process was quick. Cold. Relentless. And more devastating than any sentence was the moment when the judge said, in front of everyone, that the children would stay with me. That she would only be entitled to supervised visits. That's where she fell. That's where she really fell apart. Because it was there that she realized that betrayals don't just hurt hearts. Betrayal exacts a high price. They demand what hurts most, the bond with the one you love most. And fate doesn't forget that. She cried. He begged. She said she would go to therapy, that she would leave her ex-husband for good, that she would dedicate herself to her children. But it was too late. Trust cannot be rebuilt with empty promises. And even the children, previously attached to their mother, began to avoid her. They refused visits. They ignored calls. Because even children, even young people, recognize when they are deceived. And they knew. They knew that their mother chose another man in their father's place. They knew she lied, manipulated, hid. And they also knew that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be the same for them. In the midst of this chaos, what surprised me most was how life began to give me back, little by little, what it took from me. First came peace. The peace of being able to sleep without suspicion, without eyes watching anyone's cell phone. Then came the reunion with self-esteem. I began to look in the mirror and recognize the man I had become. And then, without looking for it, came the unexpected. A new love. A chance meeting in a bookstore, a conversation about books that turned into coffee, that turned into dinner, that turned into a hug. And suddenly, I realized that it was possible to love again. Trust again. And live something pure, without fear. But even with all this, there was something that still needed to happen. Something that would change everything. Because that woman's true karma had not yet arrived. And it would come in the most unexpected, most painful and most symbolic way possible. It would not just be a legal punishment, or removal from the children. It would be something that would completely dismantle the image she created of herself. That would force her to face the mirror of truth. That would put her, for the first time, in the place he put me, that of a broken puppet, left to its own devices. But she didn't know. I had no idea what was coming. And when it came, there was no turning back. No consolation. Not even anyone who defended her. And that's precisely where everything changes. It is at this moment that the story takes on a new meaning. Because love, betrayal, loss and revenge are just the first layers of this story. What's to come, no one, absolutely no one, could predict. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not, ever, support any type of betrayal. All the stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry deep truths about the devastating consequences that infidelity can have on people's lives. Our goal is to show, through emotion and pain, how each choice has its price. Get ready, because what comes now is a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Good story. Her name was Laura. He was 36 years old, with a smile that disguised old doubts, and a calm way of looking at the world as if he had been in too much of a hurry in his youth. He was Daniel. 42 years old, civil engineer, methodical, patient, with the kind of firmness that conveyed confidence even in the most insecure moments. They met at a university conference, on one of those nights when no one expects to find anything serious, but for some reason, a detail in the look, an effortless gesture, a silent exchange of intentions, chance decided to act. They started with unpretentious coffees and got lost in conversations that were too long for those who had exams the next day. They were friends for months, the kind of people who call each other just to tell you something silly about the day, until the friendship blossomed into something more, inevitable, natural, almost written. And what started out as shyness turned, over the years, into a relationship that seemed solid enough to withstand any wind. They married 3 years later, in a simple ceremony, full of truth and few ostentations. That's what they wanted. While many of their friends threw themselves into extravagant parties and fake appearances to please social media, Daniel and Laura chose what was essential, being surrounded by the few people who really mattered. He looked at her as if contemplating the only certainty of a lifetime. She lay next to him as if she had finally found rest. At first, sharing your life seemed easy. Two salaries that added up well, a small but cozy house on the outskirts of a slowly growing city, plans for children, modest trips and peaceful nights on the couch with series that became routine. The routine, how could something so ordinary have become the silent glue that held the two together for so long? When the first son, Benjamin, arrived, everything changed. Not for the worse, but for something new, more intense. Early mornings became longer, sleep lighter, moments together rarer. But there was a connection between them that seemed unshakable. Daniel, even though he was exhausted from work, woke up early on Sundays to let Laura sleep a little longer. He made pancakes, drew pictures for the little one and whispered stories while she was still dreaming. And when she saw her husband's dark circles under her eyes, she would prepare chamomile tea and cover him on the sofa before he even fell asleep. They didn't say everything, but they communicated with gestures, and that supported them. When the second daughter, Clara, arrived 3 years later, the chaos of the house transformed into noisy beauty. Toys scattered around, children's laughter, crying for no reason and drawings stuck on the refrigerator. Laura, who worked part-time as an image consultant, decided to take a break from her career for a while to take care of the children. Daniel, understanding, never questioned. He said that she was the pillar of the house, that he would work twice as hard if necessary, but that he would never give up her presence in the home they built together. The years passed with the speed of someone waiting for no one. Laura went back to work when Clara started attending school full-time. Little by little, she rediscovered a part of herself that had been dormant, that independent, creative woman, who knew how to dress like few others and who saw beauty even in the shadow of well-fitting pants. He began to attract attention at the events he participated in, renewed old friendships and gained new contacts. Daniel encouraged her, proudly. Seeing her blooming again was, for him, a silent pleasure. But time, that villain that changes everything without asking for permission, also began to test the solidity of the castle they had built. Romantic nights became rarer, silences began to last a little longer, conversations decreased. Not because of a lack of love, at least that was what they both believed, but because life demanded presence on many fronts: children, work, bills, commitments. Daniel, increasingly pressured at work, began to arrive late frequently. Laura, between children, home and clients, often found herself exhausted, disconnected, almost automatic. But still, she smiled when he arrived. And he made an effort to listen to the details of her day. They kept dancing, even when the steps no longer seemed so synchronized. In the neighborhood, they were seen as the ideal couple. Those who greeted each other affectionately in public, who went to school meetings together, who laughed at neighbors' parties, who seemed to have won the battle against routine. But there was a distance growing between the two. Small, almost invisible, like silent cracks in a solid wall. And nobody knew that. Not even them. Laura started to look more at herself in the mirror. She went back to the gym, took care of her hair more often, and started choosing her clothes more carefully, even if it was just to pick up the children from school. Daniel noticed, but didn't say anything. He admired it, yes, but he also wondered if this was just a rediscovery or a new chapter beginning without him. Never questioned. Never invaded. He trusted. On the weekends, they still went on family outings, took the children to the park, and cooked together. There was love, there was respect, but something was missing that neither of them could name. Sometimes Laura watched him sleeping and felt a strange longing. A desire to go back to the time when he surprised her with coffee in bed, or notes hidden in the closet. Daniel, in turn, found himself looking at old photos on his cell phone, rewatching videos from his college days, trying to understand when they stopped belonging to each other with the same intensity. But instead of talking about it, they preferred to pretend that everything was fine. After all, they had a good life. They had healthy children. They had stability. They had, above all, a story. Time continued, indifferent to the unspoken silences. Laura started to get more involved in professional events, conferences, workshops, and networking dinners. Daniel, focused on a new project at the construction company, started traveling more frequently. And so, without realizing it, they started seeing each other less, hearing each other less, touching each other less. But they were still kissing each other on the forehead before bed. They still shared the same blanket. They even told their children stories together. And they believed that was enough. Love, they thought, was stronger than wear and tear. It was stronger than the distance. It was stronger than anything. But what neither of them realized was that love is not always enough. That time, when poorly cared for, erodes even the most solid foundations. And sometimes silence also betrays. Nobody suspected anything. Not your closest friends, not your family, not your children. The apparent harmony was almost perfect. Almost. Until the day an invitation to a gala dinner changed everything. A formal, elegant invitation sent in advance. A charity event that would bring together important figures from the city. Daniel, tired from the exhausting week, refused. Laura, excited by the opportunity to reconnect with old contacts, decided to go alone. And it was that night, amid crystal glasses, expensive dresses and practiced smiles, that the first visible crack became an abyss. But this is something that is yet to come. Because, until now, everything still seemed intact. And in the eyes of the world, that couple continued to be an example that true love stood the test of time. Until, in a split second, a glance across the bright room revealed a truth that none of them would ever be able to hide. Laura spent the days following the gala dinner immersed in an agitation that she herself could not explain. It was a strange mix of euphoria and anxiety that grew silently, as if something was about to happen, but she didn't know exactly what. She dressed more carefully than usual, answered messages on her cell phone smiling alone, kept the screen turned down more often and used an almost adolescent tone of voice when talking on the phone, always in the bedroom or in the hallway, away from the prying ears of the house. Daniel, in turn, did not notice isolated details, but began to feel a subtle change in the air. It wasn't lack of love, nor coldness, it was something more diffuse, almost invisible, but present. The woman he knew so well now seemed to carry a secret in her eyes. There were no fights, no arguments, but there was a different silence in the spaces between sentences. And that, over time, started to bother me. In routine, everything went on as usual. They took their children to school, prepared simple dinners, shared the household chores. They laughed at the same jokes as their children, commented on the news on the radio, planned the month's shopping. But between the lines, something was shifting. Laura, who previously sought Daniel's presence, now seemed to avoid him with small excuses, an urgent call, an email to respond to, a sudden headache. Daniel didn't insist. I respected her space. Maybe too much. When he tried to approach her with unexpected affection or an invitation to go out, she would smile kindly but refuse. She said she was tired. Tired of work, children, busy life. But it wasn't tiredness, and deep down, he knew it. One night, while Laura was taking a shower, her cell phone vibrated on the nightstand. Daniel, on instinct, looked at the viewfinder. There was no name, just a number saved with a letter, J. The notification showed part of a message, a clipped sentence, but clear enough. I've been thinking about you since you left the room that night. He felt a chill running down his back. A dry, involuntary shiver. He put down his cell phone immediately, without opening the conversation. And no matter how much he tried to rationalize, something inside him broke. For the first time in years, he had trouble sleeping. Her face when she got out of the shower was the same as always, affectionate, calm, but in his eyes, something had changed. That morning, he turned on his side, pretending to be sleepy. She fit onto his back as usual, but her body didn't respond. He was tense, on alert. And she didn't seem to notice. In the following days, Daniel observed more. He began to pay attention to details that he previously ignored. I noticed when she smiled when responding to a message, when she hung up the phone too quickly when she saw him enter the room, when she invented appointments that had never been part of her routine. Something was wrong. And he knew. But still, he fought against his own judgment. I wanted to believe it was just insecurity, that maybe I was projecting old fears onto harmless situations. But every justification she created was dismantled by her new behavior. And the silence between them, once comfortable, now became uncomfortable. Laura was different. Not just in appearance, but in the way you walk, behave, look at the world around you. There was a restless glow about her, as if she were living a parallel story that excited her more than her real life. She started going out more frequently, always under the pretext of meetings, events or meetings with friends. Once, he said he would have dinner with an old college friend who was passing through the city. Daniel offered her a ride, but she refused. He said he would take a taxi, that he didn't want to bother him. He nodded, without question, but he spent the entire night unable to concentrate on anything. He took the car, drove aimlessly through the streets, parked a few blocks from the restaurant where Laura said she would be. He watched the movement from afar. The college friend never showed up. But she did. She wore a tight burgundy dress, different from what she usually wore for a casual date. And she wasn't alone. It was as if the world around him stopped. Daniel recognized the man immediately. Tall, elegant, firm posture. The same one he had seen that night at the gala dinner, the same one that Laura greeted with a longer than usual smile. The ex-husband. The past that had supposedly been buried years ago. They walked side by side naturally, as if repeating an old script. They laughed. They entered the restaurant as if it were usual. Daniel did not follow them. He stayed in the car, hands shaking on the steering wheel, heart pounding. Doubt gave way to certainty. And the certainty, instead of bringing relief, brought suffocating, bitter pain. He felt betrayed not only by the act, but by her complicity with someone he knew didn't deserve more space in her life. What hurt most was realizing that it didn't seem like something recent. The naturalness between the two indicated an intimacy that cannot be reconstructed over just one dinner. He came home late. He entered in silence, passed by the children's rooms, observed them sleeping peacefully. He felt a lump in his throat. The pain of betrayal was not just marital, it was family. It was the slow destruction of a story built with effort, with renunciation, with love. Laura arrived about an hour later, perfumed, serene. He gave her a light kiss on the cheek, commented on dinner, invented details, laughed at a fictional joke. And he heard everything, quietly. Didn't confront. Not that night. Because part of this I still needed to understand. He needed to find a way to react without destroying himself in the process. Over the next few days, it got colder. Not for revenge, but for self-preservation. He limited his words, kept his gestures mechanical, avoided touch. Laura noticed, but didn't comment. Maybe he knew why. Or maybe I was just settled into the new silent reality they created between themselves. Daniel began gathering evidence. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. I needed to be absolutely sure before taking any definitive action. He started reviewing call logs, bank statements, digital trails. Every detail confirmed his suspicion. Hotel reservations on days when she said she was attending events. Taxi rides started at addresses that did not correspond to the location of such meetings. Deleted conversations, suspicious schedules. Everything fit together with painful perfection. It wasn't an adventure. It was a betrayal with script and setting. An old reunion dressed as new, a fantasy rebuilt on the rubble of the wedding. Laura seemed increasingly distant. More involved in something that Daniel could no longer achieve. And no matter how much it hurt him, he didn't confront it. I watched. I expected. Because I knew that, at the right time, the confrontation would come. And when it came, there would be no room for doubts, for excuses, for emotional manipulations. He would wait until she turned herself in. Until the truth escaped her lips like an inevitable confession. That moment came on an unexpected night. An elegant invitation arrived in the mail. A new gala dinner, organized by the same charitable foundation. Laura, excited, mentioned the event during breakfast. He said he would like to go. Daniel, this time, said he would accompany her. She hesitated. Made excuses. He suggested that he rest. But he insisted, smiling, like someone who just wanted to please. She couldn't refuse. On the night of the event, Laura dressed up with an elegance that Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. She was beautiful, impeccable, but there was restlessness in her gestures. He, on the other hand, dressed calmly, with a calculated serenity. In the car, she said little. He watched everything, the eyes that avoided contact, the hands that trembled as he touched up his makeup. Upon arriving at the hall, the two were greeted with smiles and greetings. Daniel remained close, but not glued. I wanted to see her in her habitat. And he saw it. At one point, Laura walked away to greet acquaintances. Daniel waited. And he saw her cross the room, look around discreetly and walk with firm steps towards a table further away. There he was. The ex. He stood up when he saw her, held her hand naturally, kissed her face intimately. They sat down. They talked closely, smiled like accomplices. And it was then that Daniel crossed the room. His body walked steadily, but his soul seemed to crumble with each step. The guests noticed his expression. Laura saw him when it was too late. Her eyes widened. The mouth opened in the beginning of an explanation that never arrived. He didn't scream. Nothing broke. She just stopped in front of the table, looked at them both and said, in the calmest and most cutting voice she had ever used in her life, that she was single and on the street, that the divorce would be immediate and that, from then on, she should prepare to say goodbye to her children, as he would have custody. And she collapsed. But what Daniel still didn't know, was that betrayal was just the surface. That behind that reunion there was something even deeper, more cruel, more devastating. And the secret that Laura hid, if revealed, could change everything he thought he knew until then. Laura didn't sleep that night. She spent hours sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the emptiness of the now silent room, her body static and her mind imploding in 1,000 noises. Daniel had left without saying where he was going, without taking anything other than his wounded dignity. Before leaving, he didn't scream, he didn't ask for explanations, he didn't cry. He just looked at her with that silent contempt that hurt more than any swear word. In the living room, the children slept in the next room, oblivious to the abyss that had opened beneath their mother's feet. She had lost everything in a single gesture. Not just her husband, but her foundation, her name, her future with her children, what's left of her own identity. Her ex-husband, now sitting behind the wheel of the car, also no longer looked as solid as he did the night of the dinner. His eyes, once safe, now fled hers. Because he knew. I knew what she was hiding. He knew that the secret, the one that seemed buried, was about to emerge. And Laura knew that the time to face everything had come. The next day, Daniel returned home in the morning. He was sober, cold, direct. He had an envelope in his hands, a bundle of papers that didn't shake. He handed her the divorce documents and, in a firm voice, said that the custody hearing had already been requested. Laura tried to speak, but the words came out crumbly. He interrupted her without raising his tone, just with a look that said more than any sentence. She tried to get closer, tried to touch his hand, tried to summon old memories as if that were enough to dissolve reality. He recoiled, as if her touch were poison. And then she fell to her knees. Not as an actress on stage, but as someone who finally feels the real weight of what she has caused. The tears came with force, despair tore at her composure. He asked him to listen. Just that. Let him listen. Because there was something more. Something he didn't know. Something that, although it didn't erase the betrayal, perhaps explained why. Daniel hesitated. For a second, anger gave way to curiosity. And it was enough. They sat at the table. The children were at school. The house, for the first time in a long time, felt hostile. Laura took several deep breaths before starting. Daniel kept his eyes on her, without interrupting. And then, with her voice trembling and her face disfigured by the weight of shame, she began to speak. She said that months before her reunion with her ex-husband, she had been unexpectedly approached by him at a professional event. He said that, at first, he refused any contact. Who despised him for the past, for the hurts, for the marks he had left on his life. But, little by little, he got closer, in a subtle, strategic way. He talked about their past as if he had matured. She asked for forgiveness with a kind of calm that disarmed her. And then, in one of the meetings, he did something that changed everything. He said that he had discovered, through mutual acquaintances, that Daniel had invested a large part of his family assets in a suspicious business fund. He said there were documents. That there were irregularities. And that, if that came to light, Daniel's name would be involved in a scandal of embezzlement that would put everything in jeopardy. Career, child custody, reputation, life. Daniel looked at her, still not understanding. His brow furrowed, but he maintained control. Laura continued. He said that, at first, he thought it was just another move by his ex to get closer, that it didn't make sense. But, after vehemently confronting him, he showed files, prints, copies of transactions. And then, for the first time, she felt afraid. Not afraid for you, but for the children. For the family. For the destruction it could cause. The ex then offered a solution. He said he would keep it a secret, that he wouldn't reveal anything, that he would disappear with the documents, if she spent time with him. If only they met again like before. I didn't want money. I wanted Laura. I wanted to have her back, even if it was just for a while. It was blackmail. It was dirty. But she gave in. Because he believed that by doing so he would be protecting Daniel. He would be protecting his children. He believed that, by enduring this in silence, he would be saving what was left of the life they had built. Daniel, now more tense, pressed his fingers against the wood of the table. His voice was dry. He asked if she had at least confirmed the accusations, if she had confronted her husband before giving in to blackmail. Laura lowered her eyes. He said he didn't have the courage. That I didn't want him to know. Who preferred to resolve everything alone. Daniel laughed. A short, bitter laugh. He got up. He walked to the window. She was silent for a few seconds before saying, with dangerous calm, that she had believed more in a man who had hurt her in the past than in him, who had always been by her side through everything. He said that if she had come to him, they could have faced it together. But now, not only has he betrayed him physically, but he has also hurt him with the worst of violence, distrust. Laura tried to justify herself, saying she was lost, that she was afraid, that she wanted to avoid a tragedy. Daniel looked at her again. He said she chose it for him. Who decided alone to carry a burden that, in fact, did not exist. Because yes, he invested part of the funds in a new company project, but everything was legal. There were risks, of course. But nothing illegal. No scandal. No crime. Her ex-husband had invented everything. He had access to snippets of information, created a convincing narrative, and used it to manipulate Laura. And she fell. He betrayed out of fear. Out of naivety. For not trusting. The destruction of the marriage, after all, had not been caused by an irresistible desire, but by an error in judgment. Due to lack of dialogue. For a choice made in the dark. And that hurt even more. Daniel didn't scream. He didn't humiliate her. But his words went through Laura like blades. He said that from that moment on, she was no longer part of his life. That the children would be raised by him. That I would not allow them to be influenced by someone who made such fragile, wrong choices. He said that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be now. And left. Without looking back. Laura stood there, alone, with her hands on her face and her heart shattered. He finally realized that what he had lost was greater than he imagined. And that, perhaps, I would never be able to fix it again. Because there are betrayals that cannot be washed away. That can't be cured. That mark. And they stay. Like open scars. Like memories that hurt even in silence. Daniel drove for hours without a specific destination, with his eyes fixed on the road and his mind boiling in a spiral of emotions that he no longer tried to control. The conversation with Laura had revealed more than he was prepared to process. It wasn't just adultery, nor emotional betrayal. It was the discovery that he had been emotionally abandoned by someone who claimed to protect him while, in fact, condemning him without trial. Not only did she choose to trust a man who had hurt her in the past, but she also placed him in the position of a defendant with no chance of defense, no questions asked, without even a glance of doubt about the possibility of his innocence. And that, more than anything, ate away at what was left inside him. He passed a road that led to a hidden cove on the outskirts of town, a place where he used to take the children on Sundays, where he taught Benjamin to ride a bike, and where Clara discovered the stars for the first time. He parked the car, walked to the wet sand and sat there, not caring about the cold wind that cut into his skin. I needed silence, but not the kind of silence I had had at home the last few weeks. He needed a silence that would let him listen to himself, without the voices of disappointment, judgment or guilt. He picked up his cell phone, looked at the screen for long minutes, thought about calling someone, his brother, his lawyer, anyone who could give him direction, but in the end, he turned off the device and threw himself back, lying down on the cold sand as if he needed to remind his own body that he was still alive. The next morning, he returned to the city determined. I didn't want any more answers, or justifications. He did not seek reconciliation, nor revenge. I wanted action. It was time to close that chapter with the clarity and dignity that remained. He scheduled a meeting with the lawyer, organized the outstanding documents and called the children's school requesting a temporary adjustment of schedules to facilitate the new routine. When he got home, Laura had already left. There was a note on the table with words he didn't want to read. He took the envelope, crumpled it and threw it straight into the trash. She was still trying to write endings to a story he had already wrapped up inside. In the afternoon of that day, Daniel went to pick up the children. Benjamin ran into his father's arms with the same enthusiasm as always. Clara, more observant, asked if they would go home together. He took a deep breath, knelt down in front of her and explained, carefully, that they would spend time with just him, that their mother loved them too, but that they needed a different period of time now. The girl looked at him with a maturity that didn't fit her age. He just said he understood. And that silent understanding, coming from someone so small, broke him inside more than any angry scream could have. In the days that followed, Daniel immersed himself in a new routine. For the first time in years, he was experiencing life as a full-time father, without Laura's constant presence by his side. He organized the rooms, adapted schedules, learned to cook the children's favorite dishes and started telling bedtime stories that he invented himself, because he didn't want to repeat the old stories she used to read. Little by little, the laughter returned. Silences hurt less when they are filled by small voices that constantly ask, why, when, how. And in the answers, Daniel was rebuilding himself. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to fall apart more every day. Her ex-husband, after getting what he wanted, disappeared from her life without leaving a trace. The meetings stopped, the calls stopped, and the messages stopped being answered. She realized, too late, that she was just a disposable piece in a dirty game of ego and manipulation. She tried to look for him, went to his old address, called mutual friends. Nobody knew anything. Or they pretended not to know. The shame was unbearable. Instead of protection, what she got was complete humiliation. She lost Daniel's trust, the respect of her children, and now, also, the man who promised to protect her in exchange for her dignity. All that remained was the silence of one's own conscience, where each wrong decision echoed like a sentence. A few weeks later, she reappeared on the doorstep. She was haggard, visibly thinner, her eyes sunken, her hair tied up sloppily. He rang the doorbell without knowing if he really wanted someone to answer. Daniel opened the door. He stood still, waiting for her to say something. She asked to come in, just for a few minutes. He hesitated, then nodded. The children were at school. They sat in the living room. He remained standing. She began by saying that she was not there to apologize, because she knew that words now no longer had any value, but to ask for something even more difficult, forgiveness. Not to be taken back. Not to get back what you destroyed. But to be able to move forward. She said she understood if he never forgave her, but that she needed to look him in the eye and recognize the mistake, all of it, with all its consequences. Daniel listened in silence. The anger was no longer the same. Contempt had given way to a different kind of feeling. It wasn't compassion, but it was perhaps the bitterest form of pity, the kind you feel for someone who has lost themselves. She cried, not because of manipulation, but because she could no longer support her own image. She said she thought about her children every day, that she felt their absence like physical pain. Who would wake up at dawn and instinctively put dishes on the table, before remembering that they were no longer there. And that, as much as he accepted not having Daniel by his side, he still had hope of, one day, regaining his children's trust. Daniel, with his eyes fixed on the ground, responded in a low voice. He said she needed to understand that forgiveness is not synonymous with reconciliation. That he might, one day, not hate her anymore, but that didn't mean going back. She said that what destroyed them was not just the betrayal, but her choice to resolve everything alone, to go behind her back, to not trust the man with whom she shared almost half her life. That this was irreversible. He said that he didn't wish her any harm, that he hoped she would meet again, but that, from now on, their paths would be parallel, no longer crossed. She agreed. She got up, wiped her face, and thanked him for listening to her. Before leaving, he turned around and asked if he could see his children. Daniel said that when the children were ready, he would build this bridge himself. But for now, he wouldn't force them to do anything. She nodded, opened the door and left. The sound of the doorknob closing behind her was like the final period she never had the courage to put in her own story. That night, Daniel sat at the table with Benjamin and Clara. He asked if they wanted to talk about their mother. The two looked at each other, in silence, and the little girl was the first to speak. He said he missed it, but it still hurt. That he loved his mother, but didn't know if he could trust her. The older brother was quiet, but nodded in agreement. Daniel said okay. That they had time. That no one needed to decide anything now. And then, they started to eat dinner. Between shy laughs and small games, the home began to rebuild its own foundations. A few weeks later, something unusual happened. Daniel met someone. A discreet woman, who worked at the same school as his children, and whom he bumped into by chance at a pedagogical meeting. They talked about their children, about books, about the tiredness of being an adult. And without realizing it, he laughed. A light, almost forgotten laugh. The conversation turned into coffee, the coffee turned into a walk on the weekend, and the walk turned into an exchange of glances that didn't require promises, just presence. It was too early for any definition. But it was a new beginning. Laura found out about this from acquaintances. And for the first time, he didn't feel angry. He felt relief. Because deep down, I always knew he deserved more. He deserved someone who would choose him every day, even in the storms. Someone who would trust him before trusting fear. And now, finally, he seemed to be finding this new place. A place where love was not a battlefield, but a refuge. And, in the silence of her own solitude, Laura understood that betrayal does not begin when you kiss another mouth, but when you give up walking alongside, when you stop sharing the weight, when you replace the truth with silence. In life, not all stories have a return. Some have lessons. And others, scars. But sometimes, it's in the scars that we learn to love again. No fear. No rush. And, most importantly, without getting lost along the way. Time progressed with a strange mixture of slowness and urgency, as if every day were too long for those who have already suffered what they shouldn't, but still short for those who need to reorganize their own existence. Daniel was in the process of rebuilding, not only a routine, but his own way of looking at life. Now, each decision required a new type of conscience, as everything that was previously divided began to rest entirely on their shoulders. Laura's absence was felt in small things, in the spaces in the house that still held subtle traces of her, in the children's automatic habits, like calling her when they saw a new drawing or looking for her scent in the stored clothes. But what hurt most was the memory of what she represented, and not exactly what she was. Grief for a relationship is not just measured by the lack of the person, but by the absence of what it meant when there was still hope. He tried to be strong for Benjamin and Clara, and most days, he succeeded. But there were early mornings when everything seemed to give way under the weight of memories that could not be erased with correct attitudes or new stories. At the same time, Laura was going through a silent process of resignification. What began as regret turned into chronic guilt, then a kind of moral exhaustion, and finally a genuine desire for change. She sought psychological help, started weekly sessions with a therapist and delved into the depths of herself, facing the ghosts that she had ignored for so long. He discovered that most of the wrong decisions he made had much older roots than he imagined. That her fear of confrontation, her tendency to resolve everything alone, her difficulty in trusting even those who deserved it, all of this came from layers of insecurity that had accumulated throughout her life and that, when they finally came to the surface, destroyed more than she could control. She didn't try to justify herself or rewrite history. She understood that the consequences of her actions were legitimate, that Daniel was right to remove her, and that the children had the right to decide the right time to allow her presence again. But even with this awareness, the suffering was real, alive, heartbreaking. In the following weeks, the distance between her and her children remained. Clara refused all attempts at contact. Benjamin, more confused, wavered between wanting to see her and fear of getting hurt again. Daniel maintained a firm stance of respecting the children's time, but even he knew that, sooner or later, the bridge would have to be built, no matter how delicate it was. He began to realize that, no matter how much Laura had failed him, she was still the mother of their children, and that erasing that was neither possible nor fair. The wound between them was too deep to heal, but children shouldn't bear that burden. Still, the moral dilemma gnawed at him. How to protect children without depriving them of the chance to forgive? How to ensure emotional security without fueling hatred or resentment? It was a fine, almost invisible line that he walked every day, trying to balance pain and reason, justice and compassion. The new woman in his life, Sophia, appeared like a breath of fresh air, not only because of her affection, but because of the way she took her time. She understood the process, respected limitations, and above all, offered presence without charge. The relationship between the two grew calmly, without pressure, built more on daily exchanges than on big promises. The children took to her almost immediately, especially Clara, who felt safe around her, perhaps because of her sweetness, perhaps because of her lack of expectation. Sophia didn't try to occupy a place that wasn't hers. He was just there, patiently, welcoming without invading, smiling without forcing intimacy. This made Daniel feel, for the first time in a long time, that it might still be possible to rebuild a meaningful life, even in the rubble of a tragedy. Laura, upon learning of Daniel and Sophia's closeness, felt something unexpected. It wasn't jealousy. It was a different sadness, one that mixed loss with a strange kind of gratitude. She knew she no longer deserved the place she once held. But seeing that someone was caring for her children with love and respect, without trying to replace her, brought relief. She started writing letters to Benjamin and Clara, not to ask for anything, but to tell stories from their childhood, remember happy moments, convey affection without expectations. Daniel, when reading one of the letters, realized that there was a sincere attempt at reconnection. He showed the letters to the children. Benjamin read silently. Clara, when she finished reading, remained silent for several minutes, then asked if she could write an answer. It was one step. Small but legit. In parallel, new challenges emerged. Daniel's lawyer warned him that the custody process could be finalized definitively, giving him full legal rights over the children. It was what he always wanted, but now, for the first time, he hesitated. He knew that the law could guarantee authority, but it could not control the hearts of his children. Their mother's presence, even if limited, was part of their identity. Depriving them of this could be safe in the short term but emotionally dangerous in the long term. It was a cruel dilemma: protect or allow. Punish or try to reinstate. The decision was in his hands. And any choice would have consequences. Daniel scheduled a meeting with Laura and the lawyer, somewhat informally, to discuss possibilities. She arrived punctually, more serene than ever, with a resigned but lucid face. He said he would give up custody, that he would not appeal, that he trusted his decision. She said she no longer wanted to disrupt her children's lives, nor his own. But if one day there was space, I would just like to be remembered as someone who tried, even if it was too late. Daniel listened to her in silence. He felt divided. That woman in front of him was not the same as she was months ago. It was a wounded version, but more real. Someone who fell, but who, instead of hiding, chose to get up with what little was left. After the meeting, Daniel spent days reflecting. He talked to his children, to Sophia, to the therapist. He decided not to end custody permanently. He proposed a controlled visitation regime, with monitoring, somewhat progressive, that would allow the children to decide the pace. When he told Laura this, she cried like someone who had received a miracle. He didn't thank me in words. He just looked into his eyes and nodded. Daniel knew that that gesture did not mean forgiveness or forgetfulness. But it was a step towards something that perhaps, in time, could be called peace. Life began to follow a new rhythm. Sundays once again smelled like fresh coffee and cake in the oven. The children alternated between moments with their father, with Sophia and, little by little, with their mother. Laura maintained a respectful distance, avoiding overlapping spaces, but showed herself present with small gestures. He took books, cooked old dishes that his children loved, watched cartoons with them on the sofa in his own house, where a less painful silence now reigned. Daniel, in turn, found a new kind of happiness. Not the passionate euphoria of the first years of marriage, but a mature, conscious kind of tranquility built on more solid choices. He knew he would always carry the marks of what he experienced, but he learned that wounds don't need to be opened forever. That it is possible to move forward with dignity, even when you lose something that was thought to be eternal. The doubt, however, never completely disappeared. Sometimes, when he saw his children hugging their mother, he wondered if he was right in allowing this closeness. If his compassion would not have been, in a way, conniving. But then I saw the children's eyes shine again, I saw the lightness returning to their gestures, and I decided to trust. Because it is not always possible to repair the past. But it is possible to build a future where mistakes do not define destiny, but only teach how to move forward with more lucidity. And while life resumed its course, with new contours, new stories, new affections, something inside him matured. A feeling that he still didn't know how to name, but that was perhaps the deepest form of freedom, the ability to forgive without forgetting, to remember without bleeding, to love without having to return to what once destroyed him. The following months brought a new season, not just on the streets, but within each one of them. The winds that before seemed to cut now only touched, the sunlight no longer hurt as much as it passed through the windows. Life, even with visible scars, found a way to move forward, and what previously seemed irrecoverable took on less gloomy contours. Daniel remained firm with his children, cultivating a daily life full of affection, limits, and listening. The relationship with Sophia flourished at a serene pace, without the need to disguise the marks of the past. He felt whole, not in the sense of someone who was never broken, but like someone who had learned to put himself back together with his own pieces. Benjamin began to develop more defined interests. He got involved in sports and showed a certain ease with mathematics. Clara, on the other hand, immersed herself in the world of reading and demonstrated a sensitivity that sometimes amazed even Daniel. Both, even in silence, carried within themselves a mature understanding of what had happened. They had lived through the earthquake, but now they walked on the earth that had already recovered, even though it still trembled slightly beneath their feet. Laura, in turn, continued a more solitary process. The rapprochement with the children was gradual, based on small and constant actions. She had understood that trust, once broken, cannot be rebuilt with speeches, but with true presence. And so, he didn't pressure, he didn't insist, he didn't expect anything more than what was offered. Over time, Benjamin started wanting to have lunch with her on Saturdays. Clara took longer, but one rainy afternoon she accepted the invitation to make cupcakes in her old kitchen. The silences between them were still filled with memories and absence, but they were no longer walls, they were unfinished bridges. Laura knew that love no longer came easily. Every step towards children required patience, respect and humility. She did not seek to erase the past, but only to be present in what was still possible. One night, Daniel was called to a school meeting. It was about Benjamin. The pedagogical coordinator wanted to talk about some behavioral changes. There was nothing serious, but there was a noticeable restlessness in the boy, an oscillation between effort and discouragement. During the conversation, Daniel realized that perhaps his son was silently carrying an internal conflict. When they arrived home, he waited for Clara to sleep and sat with Benjamin on the porch. He said little, just offering space for the boy to say whatever he wanted. And after a few minutes of silence, Benjamin finally spoke. He said he missed his family the way they used to be, but he felt guilty about it. That he liked Sophia, that he admired his father's strength, but that sometimes he dreamed of the four of them together again. And that this desire left him confused, as if he were betraying someone by feeling what he felt. Daniel, with teary eyes, held his son's hand and responded with an unrehearsed calm. He said that longing is not betrayal. That wanting something doesn't mean disrespecting what you have. And that he, as a father, also missed many things, but had learned to transform these lacks into love for what could still be built. He said that it was normal to miss even those who hurt us, because love and pain sometimes occupy the same spaces within us. Benjamin nodded silently and rested his head on his father's shoulder. It was the first time in a long time that Daniel cried in silence, not because of pain, but because he realized that his son, even so young, understood more about life than many adults. Meanwhile, Laura continued on her way. She had resumed some professional projects and, as a result, rediscovered a version of herself that did not depend on anyone to exist. That didn't make her forget everything she lost, but it gave her ground. One afternoon, Clara, on her own initiative, asked to spend the day with her. It was a simple experience, but full of meanings. Laura took her to an art fair, then to a small cafe where they used to go when the girl was younger. They talked about silly things at first, music, series, books, but little by little the conversation touched on deeper feelings. Clara, in her small voice, asked why her mother had done all that. There was no accusation in his tone, just a genuine need to understand. Laura didn't run away. He said it was weak. Who let fear decide for her? Who forgot to trust those who always loved her? And that, even though she couldn't change the past, she would try to spend the rest of her life making her and her brother feel safe again. Clara listened in silence and then said that it still hurt, but that she was willing to try. Daniel found out about the conversation when Clara returned home. The girl told him naturally, as if that pain was finally being put into words. He listened to her carefully, respected her feelings and didn't say anything to Laura. Not because he wanted to keep his distance, but because he understood that this was a bridge that was not his place to build. It was between mother and daughter, and only the two could define the time and time needed to cross it. Over time, a new proposal emerged at Daniel's company, leading a project in another city, something challenging, with a new team and great potential for growth. It was the opportunity he had been putting off for years due to family stability. Now, the invitation seemed more pertinent. He thought for a long time before talking to his children. He brought the two of them together on the sofa and explained the situation, opened up space for opinions, listened to each argument. Clara was silent, but Benjamin asked if Laura could come along. Daniel was surprised by the question. She explained that it would depend on many factors, including her wishes and her relationship with the new city. He said he would not make this decision alone. A few days later, he looked for Laura and told her about the proposal. For the first time, there was a moment of silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable. She said that she would be happy if her children went with him, that she would support any decision, that if necessary, she would also move to stay close by. But without invading, without forcing, just to keep the ties alive. Daniel reflected for weeks. He spoke with Sophia, who was open to changes. He thought of the children, of Laura, of himself. In the end, he accepted the challenge. They moved out 3 months later. Laura, as promised, found a small apartment in the same city and started a new life there. Sophia accompanied them, and, little by little, a new network of affection was formed. It was not a traditional family. It was something different. But still, it was love. One sunny Sunday, months after moving, they organized a picnic in the city park. They were all there, Daniel, Sophia, the children and Laura. There was no ceremony, no embarrassment. Just a light coexistence, where roles were clear, wounds recognized, and affection, even if reconfigured, was legitimate. Clara drew in a notebook, Benjamin played football with Daniel, Sophia read a book against a tree and Laura prepared sandwiches. At one point, Clara approached her mother, looked at her with a smile and said that she thought that, deep down, everyone had been hurt in that story, but that now everyone was trying to take care of each other. And that was beautiful. Laura hugged her daughter, holding back her tears. Daniel, seeing the scene, was not moved by longing, but by relief. The certainty that, even with all their failures, they had managed to build something stronger than pain, maturity. There, under the sun of that new city, with the sound of children in the background, he finally understood that forgiving was not forgetting what was done, but accepting that people can change, and that sometimes, starting over is not going back, it is moving forward with more awareness of what is worth preserving. And there, in that instant, something inside him settled. As if, for the first time in a long time, life was at peace. The years passed as quickly as one day happiness slipped through the fingers of that home, and time, as always relentless and silent, redrawn the paths of each person involved in that story. The acute pain turned into a scar, the hurt settled into a discrete corner of the chest, and the traumas stopped bleeding and became memories that, although they would never be forgotten, began to be managed with more lucidity. Daniel, after wondering so much whether he would still be able to love without fragmenting himself, found a new way of living, more aligned with who he had become after everything. The relationship with Sophia grew stronger over time. She never needed to compete with a past, she never wanted to take anyone's place, she just built her own space alongside it, with patience, respect and lightness. And it was precisely this lack of pretension that made it stay. They got married in a small ceremony, in an open field, surrounded by discreet friends and children who had already matured enough to understand that love, when true, doesn't need to be shouted to be immense. Clara took the rings. Benjamin read a text he wrote himself. And that day, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, gratitude for his own story, even with all the pain. Benjamin grew up under the influence of a present father and a network of affection that, although unconventional, was enough to give him structure. He developed a keen critical sense, an unusual sensitivity and a worldview that mixed realism with compassion. He chose psychology at university. He wanted to understand human behavior, perhaps to better process everything he had experienced. Clara, on the other hand, immersed herself in the arts. She became an illustrator, using lines to say what words often couldn't. He had a silent adolescence, full of nuances, but he found a refuge and a voice in drawings. The two, despite following different paths, maintained a solid, almost intuitive connection between them, as if together they supported the most vulnerable part of each other. And neither of them ever forgot the lessons learned during that period when the world seemed to collapse before them. Laura aged slowly. After having lost everything he once considered unshakable, he rebuilt his own existence based on the truth, even if painful. He did not try to romanticize the errors, nor did he hide behind alternative versions of the facts. She carried the guilt, yes, but she no longer let it define her completely. At a certain point, he understood that his punishment would not be public, nor judicial, but rather the silent weight of knowing that he lost the most genuine love he had ever received due to a hasty choice, driven by fear and cowardice. He built a new career, became a discreet reference in his field, but never became romantically involved with anyone again. Not because of a lack of opportunities, but because I recognized that I hadn't yet learned to love without self-sabotage. The relationship with her children became possible, but it never became full again. They respected her, visited her, but the emotional distance remained, as a reminder that certain wounds, even if they heal, make touch more sensitive. And Laura accepted that. He knew that the forgiveness he received was the most he could have. And being accepted into their lives, even if only partially, was more than she deserved. Laura's ex-husband, the one who triggered the tragedy, disappeared as quickly as he reappeared. He was never seen or looked for again. It became just a name that, from time to time, would appear in brief conversations, always with a tone of silent regret. Daniel never lifted a finger against him. He never denounced him, never exposed him. Not for lack of reason, but because I understood that sometimes the most effective justice is that which comes through the conscience of those who choose the wrong path. He knew this man would forever carry the shadow of the destruction he caused. And that was more than enough. The new life in that city brought unexpected lessons. Daniel found himself involved in social projects, using his experience to help families in situations of emotional vulnerability. He became a mentor to young professionals and began giving lectures on personal reconstruction and resilience. His name became associated not with pain, but with overcoming. He was sought after by people who wanted to understand how to start over after such a profound loss. And whenever he told his story, he made it clear that he was neither a hero nor a victim. He was just someone who survived his own shipwreck and learned to swim with the arms he had left. Sophia also became his partner in these projects. Together, they built something that transcended the couple. They became a discreet symbol that love can indeed be born after chaos, and that new stories can be written without erasing the old ones. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They just lived. And that was enough. One late afternoon, Clara, now an adult, handed her father a hardcover notebook with her drawings. Inside, there were pages and pages of illustrations that portrayed scenes from childhood, happy, sad, confusing moments. On one of the last pages, a drawing showed the family together, with features that mixed reality and dreams. Next to it, a sentence written in his delicate handwriting: "The story doesn't always end the way we expect, but sometimes the right ending is the one we learn to accept." Daniel leafed through the notebook in silence, moved. He understood, in that gesture, that his children had found their own way of giving new meaning to everything. And that was the greatest legacy he could have left. Laura, in turn, grew old in peace. She dedicated herself to volunteering, taking care of children at risk, as if that were a silent attempt to give back to the world part of what she was unable to give to her own children during the time she was lost in herself. She lived alone, but had regular visits with her children. He never stopped telling them he loved them, even if the response didn't always come with the same intensity. He learned to accept it. Looking into the eyes of those who once walked away and smiling, even if the heart still carried traces of pain. And, one cold night, sitting on the balcony of her small apartment, watching the street lights below, she felt that, finally, she had understood the price of a bad choice. And that, although he never recovered everything he lost, he at least had the chance to rebuild something worthy with what he had left. The story did not end with romantic reunions, nor with miraculous reconciliations. It ended as real life usually ends, with maturity, with scars that no longer hurt, with absences that stop being wounds and become part of the landscape of the soul. Each one found their way, not as someone who wins, but as someone who survives. And this, perhaps, is the greatest victory possible after the destruction of trust. Love was not overcome by betrayal, only transformed. Redefined. And, above all, respected. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Which part marked you the most? Leave your opinion here in the comments, it is very important. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and share this video with someone who needs to hear this lesson. Here we do not support any type of betrayal. This channel exists to show how every choice has a weight and how the truth, sooner or later, always takes its toll. Until the next story.